right, so today we're in for a treat. We have my friend Nestor Maslej. He is a research manager at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI, where he also serves as the editor-in-chief of the annual AI Index report. And today we are kind of going to focus on the eighth edition of this report. And so I went to the website, and this is kind of how the report is described. The mission of the AI Index is to provide unbiased, rigorously vetted, and globally sourced data for policymakers, researchers, journalists, executives, and the general public to develop a deeper understanding of the complex field of artificial intelligence. And so with that introduction, Nestor, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I really enjoyed our interview last year. And if I remember correctly, I think part of the discussion was kind of seeing how far the AI landscape would come in a year and evaluating where things have gone and how things have changed. So very happy to be excited to talk about last year's report, the new one we have coming together, and just generally offering perspectives on how the field has evolved.
All right, so let's start, I guess, with models, right? So, 'cause, obviously, models are what capture the public's imagination and the imagination of AI teams. So, I know that the general kind of main developments this year are around reasoning enhanced models
Yeah.
and multimodality. And we can go into those, but are there other things that you feel, Nestor, are below the radar besides
In
those?
terms of kind of how the models have come
Or
technically or
just,
just kind of
just
in general?
general developments in models that you think are not as well covered?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I think the big thing seems to be kind of reasoning, the kind of increasing of that paradigm. I guess one of the things that I think I'm seeing more and more people talk about, and I think the question of whether it's under the radar depends who you ask, but I think you're starting to see increasingly smaller models gain a lot of currency and salience. And just the kind of realization that you can drive and realize really good performance with smaller systems is changing the way in which a lot of people are thinking about AI. And for me, I think interestingly, the big thing that I'm kind of seeing now and also looking forward is less about the technology and kind of thinking more about how businesses are willing to adapt it and embrace it. I mean, certainly the technology is getting better. There's no doubt about that. But I think we're kind of now already at a point where the technology is good enough that it could do a lot of things for businesses. And for me, the interesting question moving forward is, are businesses actually going to find a good way to use this technology? And that's something that I think maybe not enough people are talking about or thinking about.
So speaking of smaller models, I mean, one sign here is that even if you look at the providers who push out proprietary models, so here I'm talking mainly about OpenAI and Google Gemini, they have actually a suite of models, some
Yeah.
big, some small. But then you go to the open source models, obviously you have smaller models there too as well, right? So for example, Gemini has this family of models called Gemma, which are smaller. So uh, based on your I guess data gathering and data sources, what's your sense of adoption and interest in these smaller models?
I mean, I think there is a strong sense, but I think a lot of it depends on like what you're trying to do from an industry perspective. And I'll kind of take a step back and, I think it's interesting to kind of start with the adoption question first and foremost. I mean, that to me was one of the biggest highlights in this year's report, which is that adoption figures really seem to be kind of going up. We were kind of hovering around the 50% range in terms of organizations reporting that they've used AI in at least one business function in the early 2020s, and that's now shot up to 78% according to a McKinsey survey. So organizations are as a whole more into AI. Now, I think there is excitement in small models depending on the function that you're trying to realize. And this is again what I mean when I talk about this question of how are businesses actually going to work to integrate the tools? Because if you talk to legal teams that are thinking about using these models, I mean, they prioritize accuracy and intelligence. And I think they're willing to pay a higher premium for a model that is slower and costs more, but at the end of the day is a lot more accurate. Whereas if you're kind of doing a workflow where, yeah, you do need something that's accurate, but something that perhaps is fast is also prioritized. Maybe you're trying to build a customer-facing chatbot with one of these models. A smaller model is then going to offer a lot of value. So I think kind of broadly, there is a lot of excitement with the small models, depending on the use case that you see. But I mean, just the trend line is very clear here. We have a figure that looks at the smallest model in terms of parameter size that scores above a 60% on MMLU. And I think you go from Palm, released in May of 2022, which had close to 540 billion parameters, all the way to Phi 3 Mini, which was released in May of 2024, that had just 4 billion parameters. So these models are getting smaller and smaller at a set performance level. And I think that's something that a lot of businesses are definitely very excited about.
And to tie this back actually to both adoption and reasoning, uh, one of the main developments this year, of course, is the comeback of reinforcement learning, right? So
Yeah.
last year, custom models was basically supervised fine-tuning. This year, reinforcement fine-tuning. Now, based on my conversation, reinforcement fine-tuning as of this moment, while we're talking, is still a bit of an advanced topic.
Yeah.
But there are a bunch of people trying to build tools to make this accessible and democratize it, in which case, what Nelson just mentioned about small models, you can customize reasoning models as well that are small.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of speaks to a broader trend that we're seeing, which is I think a lot of companies trying to find ways to leverage their existing data in combination with these models to kind of drive further performance. Because it seems like out of the box, a lot of these LLMs can do a lot of good things, but I think companies are starting to realize now, hey, if we have kind of pools of data and we find a way to integrate that data with models, we could get some of these models to do very good things. And in some cases, you can then get a small model that maybe ordinarily wouldn't have been that high performing to then drive a lot of value and to really accelerate what your business can do.
So, I guess the other question I wanted to ask you is, are there any noticeable trends when it comes to, I guess, the notion of model transparency or openness of the models? I know that in the past, some models, the weights were available, but obviously, anyone who's worked in open source knows that's not really open source, right? So that's just
Yeah, yeah.
open weights. So are there noticeable trends towards one, the supply side? Are so obviously DeepSeek and Quen are new suppliers of open weights models. I guess on the demand side, I'm not sure if I guess some companies care if the model is open weights, but what are some kind of high level trends around openness and open weights? And I know that OpenAI has hinted that they're now about to open something up. I don't
Yeah,
know
I
exactly
did see
what
that actually.
I
Yeah,
don't
it's
know
pretty
exactly
interesting.
what that is, but yeah, talk to us about openness in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two big trends that I'm seeing, which is first that just open source models, or sorry, open weight models, as you're kind of correct to point out that open source might be a slightly misleading term. Open weight models appear to be much stronger than they were a year ago. And I think generally in the ecosystem, there appears to be more transparency. So, kind of on the first point, I think when you look at January 2024 on LMSys, we estimate that there was roughly a kind of 8 percentage point gap between the best closed weight model and the best open weight model. So for the viewers that might not be familiar, LMSys is a very popular public benchmark of model preference. And basically within a year, as of February 2025, that gap had narrowed to 2%. So the best closed weight model is still better than the best open weight model, but not by a really meaningful amount. And I think that is significant because there are some advantages to building with open weight models that you don't have with closed weight models. But I think a year ago, one of the arguments that you could have made was that, well, closed weight models are simply higher performing, they're more reliable, they're more accurate. And I think the introduction of a lot of these new models like the Llama 3 series, the as you mentioned, kind of DeepSeek releases, they've kind of closed that gap and changed the way in which businesses kind of make that calculus. So, first highlight, I think, is just that the gap in performance, which was pretty pronounced last year, seems to be closing. And I mean, there is some evidence as well that I think the ecosystem is becoming marginally more transparent. There's a project out of Stanford that we cite in the index, and that I also had the pleasure of contributing to, but it was the Foundation Model Transparency Index. And it's basically its own index that is trying to kind of rank how transparent the foundation model providers are. And one of the things that the index had found is that from October 2023 to May 2024, when they kind of did an updated version, the ecosystem did appear to become a bit more transparent. Now, there are still a lot of companies that are kind of lacking in certain key verticals, but transparency does seem to be going up. I mean, there are still ways to go, but in some domains, the space is becoming more transparent and more understandable, which I think is overall a good thing to see.
So the if you look at LMSys right now, right?
Yeah,
So the open weights models there that are doing well are from China, right? So
yeah,
DeepSeek and Qwen from Alibaba. So obviously we're anticipating that the Llama family models will come out with something soon, but it seems like uh, at least the proprietary models of from Google, Anthropic, and OpenAI, their cadence seems to be much more frequent than Llama,
yeah,
but the Chinese open weights models are keeping up with that release cadence.
yeah.
Is
At least in the last, at
am
least in
I
the last
wrong either? Yeah.
No, I think that seems to be right. I think that's kind of the trend that we've observed. But I mean, yeah, the cadence of Llama's release hasn't been as frequent, but I think the performance improvements from every subsequent version of Llama have been pretty remarkable. I mean, I think that one of the last big Llama releases was in the summer of 2024. And I think when they kind of launched that model, I think that was quite impressive to me because it really highlighted how far open weight had come. And I remember kind of seeing some discussions, can't remember if it was from Jan LeCun or from Mark Zuckerberg, basically saying like, yeah, we know we're not at the top of the leaderboard right now, but we have a lot of faith that we're going to be in a year. So maybe it's kind of Meta is betting on a strategy of less frequent, but kind of more consequential model releases. But I mean, I think the fact that they've improved as much as they have really kind of signals how competitive the ecosystem is becoming and how much the frontier is tightening. That's really another big takeaway from the report, which is that, compared to 2, 3 years ago, where you maybe had a couple of providers and there was one, I think, OpenAI that was clearly ahead, you're kind of now looking at a highly competitive, highly tight ecosystem where there are 4 to 5 developers. You could probably say OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, maybe you could throw in Mistral, DeepSeek, Meta, that are all releasing fairly capable models that score fairly similarly.
Yeah. So obviously the other main area in as far as foundation models is multimodality, right? So
Yes.
you hear about these visual language models, but one specific capability that I'm actually interested in is um, the ability of these models to interact with graphical user interfaces,
Yes.
which is important for agents, right? Are there any kind of significant developments from 2024 to 2025 around some of these capabilities that regular knowledge workers can will benefit from? Because I know, for example, uh, multimodality means now I can feed video and audio to these models and they'll help me, right? So they'll help me understand the video or audio. But a lot of knowledge work involves graphical user interfaces,
Yeah.
right? So what is there any progress in these areas?
Yeah, I think there's a few interesting points of research to highlight. I would generally say, though, that it's hard to kind of benchmark quote unquote agentic progress as neatly as it is progress in kind of other intellectual domains. And that's, I think, another thing that we talk about in this year's AI index. Not that AI has a benchmarking problem, but I think in the last decade, we kind of tracked progress in AI by looking at like how well could it classify images, how well could it answer college level mathematics or history questions. Those are very easy knowledge benchmarks to set
Or
up because
coding?
there is
Coding is another
coding,
one.
exactly, yeah. There's a correct answer, there's an incorrect answer. Whereas agentic tasks are they're much more multifaceted, much more complex. So there doesn't really seem to be an agentic benchmark that has kind of captured the heart of the AI community in the way that ImageNet or MMLU have. And I mean, I think in last year's report, we profiled one benchmark called Agent Bench, and we were thinking about looking at it again, but the benchmark suite kind of completely evolved, I think reflecting the fact that the kind of way in which people are trying to evaluate this space has changed. So, I mean, it does seem like these systems are getting better, but it's also kind of hard to really understand in a very comparable way, what can one system do versus another. But I have seen some interesting research that has suggested that in certain kind of agentic settings, I think there's this one paper that we cite in the technical performance chapter that looks at the performance of AI agents on computer science research tasks. And they found that in those settings, AI systems typically can do better than humans when given a very short time budget. But basically, when you kind of look at tasks that are substantially more complex and that require a much larger time budget, like 32 hours, then humans tend to outperform the AI systems almost by a factor of two. So I think that kind of research suggests to me that for some of the simpler, lower level tasks, we already have models that are, good and effective. But as tasks become kind of more complex and iterative, there is still this kind of human advantage in the equation. And of course, the question that you even asked kind of makes one think of the fact that, yeah, we already have this very powerful underlying technology, but the challenge, I think, in many ways is more figuring out how do we actually retool it so that it's useful for things that businesses are doing? Because I don't think the chatbot is the ideal way to use an AI system. That's kind of the de facto interface, but maybe we're going to be looking at different interfaces in the future.
So last year we talked about benchmarks, right? So and
Yeah.
that there's a whole subset of people focus on building better benchmarks. So is there any news on the benchmark front?
Yeah, I mean, there is. There has been well, I'd say kind of two pieces of news. A lot of the benchmarks that came out in 2023 that I think were kind of modeled as these new groundbreaking, challenging benchmarks are seeing AI systems progress on them in remarkable ways. So I'm thinking about benchmarks like MMMU, GPQA, and SWE-bench, and on all of these benchmarks, performance of the best AI systems has increased, anywhere from 20 to 60 percentage points in the last year. So this is kind of this phenomenon that we're seeing where, researchers are launching new benchmarks, and none of these benchmarks have saturated yet, but we've seen remarkable jumps in improvement in very short periods of time. And we're kind of now getting ourselves to this moment where there have been new intellectual challenges that have been released. Like I think ArcAGI, which we feature in the report this year, I think they recently launched a new benchmark, which is still challenging systems. There was another benchmark from Epoch AI released this year called Frontier Math, which is a very complex mathematical benchmark that even a lot of the really high quality systems struggle on. And funnily enough, there was another benchmark that was launched, which was labeled as, I'm not sure if you heard of this, humanity's last exam. Kind of the kind of joke being that like this is going to be the last test, at least academic test, that we're going to need to test these systems on. But I think, Ben, it goes back to a broader question of what purpose is benchmarking serving? And where are we going to go in the future? I mean, benchmarks exists so that we can understand intellectually what these systems are doing. But out of convenience, we've created these very kind of easy academic tests, which I think now the best AI systems exceed the best humans on without question. But there's still a lot of other intellectual tasks in the world that we can't capture as neatly on in these tests that AI systems aren't able to do, right? Like knowing how to crack an egg or even kind of in any given day, driving a car, speaking multiple languages, reading, writing, all these things that humans do, it's a little bit messy to kind of capture that in a neat benchmark, but that probably is the kind of new frontier we need to get to in terms of actually understanding what is the next thing that some of these AI systems could do.
So are there notable uh, I guess the equivalent of benchmarks would be these prices, like the X price. Are
Yeah.
there notable prizes or competitions like that that came out over the last year that people are got excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one that I've seen recently, we don't feature this most recent one in the report just because I think it came out very, very recently. But I think there was a prize, an older one called ARC AGI.
Oh yeah.
And that one, I think, was really kind of premised around a very difficult reasoning challenge for these AI systems. And I think the idea was that you wanted to kind of challenge AI on generalized learning abilities. And I think on these tasks, AI systems can prepare in advance. And it doesn't really require specialized world knowledge, which these language models learn easily, but the ability to kind of draw on assumed prior knowledge, like concept of objects, basic topology, elementary arithmetic. Now, I think one of the big news stories of 2024 in AI was that there was a massive jump in the performance of the best models on these systems. I think like the best model in 2023 scored, I think around 30%, 33 if I'm not mistaken. And then O3, which was again kind of launched, not even publicly released, but the results were launched on a YouTube video, supposedly scored a 75.7%, not including the kind of higher budget option, but the one that was kind of within the competition rules did a lot better. And it seems like as a result, the researchers have responded with a new benchmark, ARC AGI2, and it seems like the best systems are still scoring fairly poorly on that. But I mean, every year it seems to be the story of like, okay, AI has saturated these five benchmarks, let's introduce four more. And the next year we kind of record this podcast and it's like, well, it's saturated these four benchmarks. Let's see if we can introduce a few more.
By the way, at the end of the day, I actually don't look at these benchmarks. I look at LMSys and
Yeah.
then I actually use the models on my use case
Yeah, 100%.
because that's the main test. So actually, you brought up something that's been bothering me a little bit about some of these models in the sense that uh, not bothering, but it's something that people should consider when they use these models or hear about these models is that uh, we're now at the point where these models can actually do a lot with brute force computation.
Yeah.
So in other words, you can imagine, I don't know, I'm just making this up, like Claude Code, right? So I have a Jira ticket that I have to resolve. You point Claude Code to this Jira ticket, it will just burn so much compute and try everything brute force, and it might actually resolve that ticket. And it might still be cheaper than hiring a software engineer, right? So,
Yeah.
but you have to also consider, as Nestor points out, the budget
Yeah.
for using these models, because especially the reasoning models can really consume a lot of tokens and budget, right?
Yeah, they're slow. And I mean, it kind of, yeah, it goes back to the point, which is the one that you had, which is, yeah, you need to evaluate what model serves your function best. And that's another kind of commentary on this culture of benchmarking that it seems like we have these benchmarks because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, AI researchers in universities were trying to understand what could these models do intellectually. And benchmarks were the best way of doing that. Now it seems like the goalposts have moved and that we're in an era where businesses are trying to figure out what models they should build with. But how useful is it for a business to be told that any given model is scoring a 97% on this benchmark of grade 8 math questions, right? I'm not doing grade 8 math questions in my job. I don't think you are either, right? And I've had experiences where, part of the AI index, I'm happy to say, is made with the assistance of AI. We use AI to copy, edit, proofread. And I find that certain models are a lot better at copy editing than others. But to my knowledge, there's no benchmark that could really neatly and reliably assess what the difference is there. So it just kind of really goes to show you that, yeah, this kind of self-evaluation is important. And it's not really just a question of what the best model is. It's a question of what do you need to do? What are your goals? What are your constraints? And how do you then find a model that kind of works within those parameters?
Inference, right? So inference and inference scaling is a topic this year. Uh, I know that, if you had like a an old school model like GPT 3.5 or some non-reasoning model, right? So people have had a couple of years to optimize the hell out of inference. So that inference for non-reasoning models seems to be plummeting, right? On the other hand, the reasoning models, as we discussed, not only is it expensive, there's latency involved because it's thinking, it's
Yeah,
trying
yeah.
things out and stuff. So, are there any trends in the report around inference costs and inference scaling?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we actually added a completely new section this year looking at inference cost. And basically, we worked with Epoch AI. They're a great research outfit that's collaborated with the AI Index a few times now. And we use data from Epoch AI's proprietary database on API pricing and artificial analysis, which is another great website that kind of does its own analysis of what some of the costs are to basically look at how inference costs have changed over time at a fixed AI performance threshold. And basically, what they kind of found is that the inference cost of an AI model that scores the equivalent of GPT 3.5 on MMLU basically has dropped from around $20 per million tokens. And we look at a weighted average of input and output tokens. So it went from around $20 per million tokens in November of 2022 to just 7 cents per million tokens in October of 2024. And that's a reduction of more than 280 times in approximately a year and a half.
Now
And
we need that for the reasoning models.
yeah, exactly. So that's, for reference, that's kind of what we're doing in the kind of overall models. And on the reasoning models, when you kind of up the standard, when you kind of look at GPQA, like harder benchmarks, you see a similar trend in that inference costs do go down, maybe not as much kind of proportionally as some of the other models, but they're also kind of decreasing. Now, if you're going to be working with the kind of flagship model that any company offers, like the kind of O1s, I mean, those costs are astronomically more higher. So as a whole, they are kind of dropping at a fixed level of performance. But again, it kind of comes back to the question that you were fundamentally asking, which is what is your business trying to do, and how does that use case align with what models can offer?
Yeah, yeah, and also you have to do some sort of financial modeling on your end, right? So
Yeah,
so take two examples, right? So the coder and an analyst, right? So on the coding side, right? So like I said, you can burn through a lot of compute and maybe uh, resolve a lot of this Jira tickets and bugs, but it'll cost you. But the question is what you're getting as good as and cheaper than a junior developer, right? So, and
yeah,
then on the analyst side, I suppose you can use deep research or its competitors to do some analysis. But again, the question is, does that save you analyst time? So I don't think it's a complete replacement for analysts yet, but because ultimately there's still a lot of things in the brain that in terms of judgment
yeah.
and
Well, I think it's, if I can jump in, I think it's two
yeah,
things, which is like one,
yeah.
what is any person doing on a day-to-day in terms of their kind of job, and how automatable is that given the technology? And I think second, like, what is the priority of industry? Is it going to kind of tend towards automation or augmentation? So on the first point, like I'm a researcher by trade, but I spend significant portions of my day writing emails. Sometimes I need to use a more authoritative tone to one person, a less authoritative tone to another person. I need to maybe copy it in very particular ways. And I use AI to do that, but the interface that I'm working with, chatbot wise, is very clumsy. So, if there was a better application layer that, yeah, as you said, can almost like understand the second or third order kind of thoughts that you have as you reason and as you do work, that would kind of presumably automate a lot and save a lot of time.
And ask the critical questions that you would come up with, right? So because the reason I bring this up, Nestor, is I know some people who are trying to build kind of an AI analyst, right? So let's
Yes.
say you assign it the task. So what's the right value for NVIDIA or Tesla,
Yeah,
right? So but it turns out that that's a hard problem because if you look at the really gifted Wall Street analysts, it really comes down to what kind of questions are these people asking and
Yeah.
how do they probe around this problem, right? So
Yeah.
it's not like they just do a Google search and then compile all of that, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And it kind of dovetails with like this question of, yeah, like who is AI going to actually help? We have a lot of data in this year's report that looks at the productivity impacts of AI. And a lot of the literature really seems to be showing that AI has positive productivity impacts. Interestingly, most of the studies that we've seen seem to suggest that AI tends to benefit lower skilled workers more than higher skilled workers. As in a lot of these studies, both high and low skilled workers perform better with AI, but low-skilled workers increase their performance by a greater amount than high-skilled workers. But there's still a gap at the end of the day. But there has been some other research that has come out in the last year. I think one particular study that looked at AI and scientific discovery that found that AI systems actually most helped high-achieving scientists versus low-achieving scientists. So this is again another question that relates to this business integration element that the effect that AI might have might be quite task specific. And depending on what you're actually trying to do and what you need these systems to do, AI systems as they are construed now could be very useful, whereas in other tasks they might not be as helpful.
Actually, there's something counterintuitive about adoption as well that I want to run by you, right? So for software developers, right? So people are saying, well, so all these tools are going to just basically obliterate junior developers.
Yeah.
But no, actually, the junior developers are the ones who are adopting these tools.
Yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
they're the ones that might actually be able to survive because in future software developers will be a combination of AI and human, right? So it
Yeah,
turns out that if you look at surveys, if you bucket the developers into three categories: junior, mid-career, and then experienced, the junior and experienced are much more likely to adopt it than the mid-career, right? So which would be the traditional mentors of the junior, right? So the mid-career people might be the ones who might get blindsided by this technology.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that of course AI is going to change the way in which we work. I don't think it's gonna, and maybe this is a prediction that's gonna come back to bite me. I don't think it's gonna lead to these kind of massive layoffs that a lot of people kind of predict. I mean, I certainly hope not as a human, but I think part of that intuition comes from, I think, a few different things. So one is actually like, what does the data tell us? Well, we had data in last year's report that asked, basically, I think McKinsey asked a bunch of business executives, do you think that AI is going to increase your workforce or decrease your workforce in the next 3 years? And I think the largest proportion, I think 43%, said that they thought that AI would lead to a decrease in the size of the workforce. Now, McKinsey asked this question again. They kind of re-upped this survey. And now, kind of overall, the amount of people that are kind of reporting or seeming to kind of say that AI is going to decrease the size of the workforce has kind of gone down to 31%. So it seems like executives think less and less over time that AI is going to downsize. And if you talk to a lot of businesses that are embracing AI, they tell you, like, we're using AI, we're saving all this time, and we're reinvesting this time into doing other things. And I mean, my own experience bears this out, right? You kind of, before we got on the podcast, you commented on the size of this report. This is the fourth report that I've worked on. The first one was around 200 pages. Now, when I worked on the first one, we had a team of two. This most recent one is 500 pages, so 2.5 times as large. And we still have a team of two people that are working on it. And what's happened there is we've become a lot more productive because our process is better. We're using AI as well. And we've reinvested all this extra time that we have to do things that we couldn't do before. And this is this kind of classic augmentation versus automation trade-off that a lot of businesses face. You can use the technology to save time, but you could also reinvest that time to do other things.
So another question for you, I think we may have talked about this last year, is this notion that this people building foundation models and doing pre-training are running out of data,
Yeah.
and that they're increasingly turning to augmenting their data with synthetic data. So, any update on these?
Yes, there definitely is some kind of update on that. I think one of the big things that we're finding out is that it kind of depends on the context that you're dealing with. So there's a lot of kind of factors at play here. So I think last year we had cited some data from Epoch that kind of estimated when people might run out of data. And they've re-upped this estimate. They've kind of done another project looking at it, and they're kind of projecting with an 80% confidence interval that the current stock of training data is going to be fully utilized somewhere between 2026 and 2032. Now, there's a lot of different things that kind of depend on this, right? Which is like one is how much our data set size is going to grow, how available our data set's going to be. One of the big findings that we talk about in the index is we profile this research that showed this year that a lot of websites are now instituting crawling restrictions, which is making it a lot more difficult for data to be scraped, right? If the data commons become smaller and smaller, there's going to be less and less data.
But is that honor system?
What do you mean is that honor
So
system?
if I put on my robots that text don't crawl, I mean, OpenAI can ignore that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's different workarounds, but we there. It's also possible to imagine, the legal landscape around this changing if there are more stringent regulations in that kind of space as well. Now,
And by the way, sticking on this topic for a second, Nestor, this is a particular issue that the U.S. proprietary foundation model
yeah,
builders, Anthropic and OpenAI, are passionate about because they point out to the Trump administration, if we don't have some sort of fair use policy for
yeah,
data, China is gonna surpass us.
yeah, there's a lot of concerns that kind of figure into this, and I think, so the one question is like how much data is going to be available. One question is, how much more efficient are these models going to get? I mean, it does seem like the models are getting more and more efficient, so we're squeezing a lot more out of the data. And at least the research that I've suggested suggests that synthetic data can be useful in certain contexts. When it comes to generally training LLMs, I think the suggestion is that if you are stacking synthetic data on top of existing data, the model is not going to get a lot better, but it's not going to get a lot worse. Whereas if you're replacing existing data with synthetic data, then the model performance is going to degrade. But we also have data in this year's report that looks at trends in kind of health and science. And interestingly, in health and science, there appear to be a lot of domains where synthetic data does seem to be actually quite effective and does seem to be driving a lot of performance improvements on certain tasks. It's not necessarily clear to me why that's the case. Maybe in some of these healthcare domains, there is just less of an existing data pool to work with. But the kind of question around synthetic data seems to be it depends. And, that's the frustrating thing about AI, that it's a space that moves so quickly. But I think each subsequent jump in the space in terms of what happens today versus what might happen tomorrow massively changes because the landscape is moving quickly, and sometimes the kind of intuitions we might have about where it might go tend to not necessarily be the right ones.
So the other big news this year is, I guess, the reemergence of this rivalry between the U.S. and China,
Yeah,
particularly with the release of DeepSeek's reasoning models.
yeah.
So, where are we in terms of set aside DeepSeek, but just generally, what's the top line in terms of I guess publication? I guess, are publications still a valid way to compare U.S. and
Yeah,
China?
I mean, I think it depends how you look at it, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things, so
Or patents and publications, are they still a valid way to compare these two countries?
yeah, I mean, I think you need kind of a holistic approach, right? Because China, for example, dominates when it comes to AI patents, but they have way more people. And I mean, patenting can also be quite dependent on localized patent laws and kind of the culture around what grants might actually mean. So let me kind of lay out all the data and then we
Mhm.
can maybe kind of discuss what it might mean. So I think if you actually look at total number of notable models produced, I think the United States is still fairly far ahead. In 2024, there were 40 notable AI models by our estimates that were coming from the United States compared to just 15 from China and 3 from Europe. Now, Chinese models did catch up. I think that's the big story in 2024, that the performance difference between the best US and best Chinese model on virtually every single benchmark decreased and is right now kind of at parity. And I think DeepSeek's most recent launch really kind of pioneered that the most. Now, China does lead in terms of aggregate publications and aggregate patents, but it depends again on like how you look at publications. One of the things that we did this year for the first time is we did an analysis where we looked at the number of highly cited publications, so like top 100 AI cited publications, and tried to see what countries they were coming from. And basically, if you look at this list of publications from 2021, 2022, and 2023, the US is far and ahead of China. So by certain metrics, the US does seem to be producing still kind of higher quality research on aggregate, but I think the kind of delta is definitely closing as we speak.
So in public policy circles, there's this term that people use called diffusion,
Yeah.
right? So think about in past technology revolutions, electricity or the internal combustion engine, right? So diffusion of those technologies took years, if not decades, right? So in the case of AI, so if you look at these two AI superpowers, US and China, what's the best way to gauge where they are as far as diffusion? I know, for example, that the stereotype, Nestor, is China is much more ahead or has many more deployments of robotics, right? So,
Yeah.
so, but what, how should we think of these two countries as far as diffusion? Diffusion meaning, I guess, the actual usage and adoption, right? So,
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, yeah, I think as you're kind of right in saying that there's, I think, certain general stereotypes which are borne out in the data. Yeah, China does tend to lead in industrial robotics and patenting. It also has a very vibrant self-driving ecosystem. I mean, if you've been in San Francisco, you've seen the Waymos around and they've taken over some US cities, but China's also doing fairly well in that space as well. But it's one of those things where you would love to have some more kind of concrete data on, but it's difficult. It's just difficult to kind of get that data. I mean, one of the data points that I know for sure that we have looks at AI use by organizations in the world across geographies. This is kind of data coming from McKinsey. And I think the geographic region that leads in terms of usage as of 2024 is North America, and it's a few percentage points ahead of China. But again, this is just looking at one particular thing, which is organizations that are reporting in one survey how often they use these kind of AI technologies. There's another question of like how much are individuals actually using it. I think one area where there does seem to still be a fairly pronounced difference, and this is something that we commented on in the AI index a few years ago for the first time, seems to kind of be in the public perception of the technology. So China, according to Ipsos survey data, is substantially more bullish on AI products and services than the United States. Now, the United States is getting more bullish, as in they were more negative in 2022, and they seem to every year be getting more and more positive, but there's still a very big gap in these two countries around how they feel about this technology.
so actually, when after the DeepSeek reasoning models got released, what surprised me is how quickly I started reading stories in the Chinese press about uh, I don't know, Chinese hospitals, Chinese companies taking that DeepSeek model and using it. So yeah, I don't like, for example, I don't know if there's an equivalent like when Llama got released, you started reading stories of US companies using Llama within a month, you
Yeah.
know? So it seems like they are more, and part of that might be because some of these hospitals, the government tells them to, hey, you should look into this models and stuff. So it seems like they're more likely to jump in than their US peers. Am I wrong?
I mean, it's something that I mean, I think it depends who you talk to. It's something that we don't have concrete data on in the report, but it kind of reflects the fact that there's so many questions in this space that you do want to get information for. And that's one where, we can only kind of speculate at the moment. But moving forward, I think there is an interest in kind of understanding, yeah, in a bit more of a disaggregated way, how some of these businesses and people are using these tools. I mean, the data does suggest that a lot of businesses are reporting using AI, but whether they're using open versus closed weight models, which models they're using, are they running multiple different experiments with multiple different models? That stuff is still kind of missing and something that we definitely want to get information on.
Tying this back to our earlier discussion about open weights and the open ecosystem, right? So it seems like this is where China has really kind of uh, leapt ahead of the US, because basically Quen and DeepSeek models are open weights, and they're newer than the Llama open weights model. Now I know that Gemma, Google just released Gemma, and that OpenAI may release something that's open. But do you think that this is going to hurt the US? Because basically, set aside US companies, but companies outside of the US in the developing world or somewhere else may start building around these Chinese open weights models.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think two things. It's funny that, there's this perception perhaps that China has leapt ahead in that particular domain because there is a lot of kind of data that suggests that, a lot of these Chinese developments were perhaps inspired partially by the Llama model. And I'm sure that a
Oh
lot
yeah,
of,
yeah, yeah. I'm not saying that
no, 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 of course. I'm just,
they innovated, but in terms of the excitement around the models they released.
yeah, yeah. I think it depends also on the pace of release, right? Like you can imagine that if Meta in the next, half a year releases, Llama 4 or wherever they are in their kind of developmental pipeline, and it is, state of the art or kind of top class, then that's going to change the way in which we talk about AI. So I think it's like difficult to kind of prognosticate at the moment. And I think for me, what would be a really interesting question, maybe this is one we can ask in the index next year, is like to what degree are businesses that are not headquartered in China willing to kind of build on top of and work with Chinese models? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it would be very interesting to see, if it is the case that Chinese open source or open weight models are still a bit better than American ones in kind of 6 months, are a lot of American European businesses that prefer to work with open weight models willing to kind of work with Chinese ones, or are they still demonstrating a preference for models that are coming out of Europe or the United States?
Wasn't it Chris Manning who said basically it's really ironic that for us in academia to learn about the developments in these new models, it's the Chinese. We're learning more
Yeah,
from the
yeah.
Chinese than the American companies.
Yeah, I think he had said something along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, did you in this year's report, Nestor, do a deep dive into infrastructure?
Yes, we started
that's a big deal, right? So in
we
terms of
started we definitely started thinking about that. Yeah.
yeah, in terms of energy sources, not just energy sources, but transmission lines, transformers, uh, just the entire build out of data centers that you need. Forget about pre-training, but just inference for these reasoning models, right? So
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to kind of cut this. I think we're every year trying to kind of add a little bit more data on just like totals of like, where these supercomputers exist, who's reporting on them, what that kind of data might mean. I think that there's a few big things that we're definitely seeing. So I think one is just the energy discussion. I think you can't talk about AI in 2024 without mentioning the fact that it seems like a lot of these major AI players have started to kind of consider where they're getting the energy to power their kind of training runs. And in a lot of cases, there seems to be some kind of nuclear connection. I think there's kind of no story that epitomizes this more fully and completely than I think it was the story of Microsoft, if I'm not mistaken, basically saying that it's going to revive the Three Mile Island nuclear reactor to power its AI data centers. But it was also Google and Amazon that had similar initiatives that they announced. So I think that's kind of one story. The energy dynamics are changing. But also, a lot of governments now are very actively committing to AI infrastructure investments. In 2024, several countries across the world, Canada, France. I mean, France's announcement was in 2025, but let's just say in the last year and a half, you had Canada, France, the UAE, Singapore, India, a bunch of other countries committing to pledge a surplus of over $1 billion. In some cases, France was committing as much as 110, I think, million euros, or sorry, billion euros to build out AI infrastructure. So that seems to be a very big story. And it seems to also kind of mirror another big narrative, which is this kind of changing in vibe in the AI ecosystem between maybe concerns around safety versus concerns around opportunity. And I think you saw this really well with the evolution of these AI summits, where the first one that was held in the United Kingdom at the end of 2023 was ostensibly oriented around safety. That was the concern. Whereas the people that I know that went to Paris in February, they talk about how the discourse has evolved and changed to be about action and opportunity. And I think some of these infrastructure plays are really reflective of that changing narrative.
Yeah, in Paris, basically the safety people were missing in action, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the game has changed.
I'm not sure if they were disinvited or they were just not on the agenda for some reason.
I can't speculate to that, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so in closing, any closing thoughts in terms of what are you personally looking at for the rest of 2025? What are you excited about, and what would you like to monitor?
It's a great question. I think for me, the thing that I kind of think about the most is, yeah, I think really trying to understand what it's going to take for businesses to get on board with this technology more fully. And I come at this from a bit more of a historical perspective where I think if you look at historically significant technological revolutions, whether it's the introduction of steam, portable power with electricity, or IT, a lot of economists estimate that, it takes a decade to two for the productivity impact of these technologies to be fully felt. Largely because if you're a business that is building with steam, you have a steam factory, you can't just retrofit it overnight to be electric. You need to change how you produce goods or how you make things to take advantage of this new technology. We're kind of now 2.5, 3 years out from, let's say, the beginning of this kind of AI movement, if you can kind of call the launch of ChatGPT as that. And we're still very early days in this narrative. And I do wonder and want to understand, what is it going to take for businesses to really get in on this technology and for this technology to kind of drive this kind of productivity forward en masse? I mean, it's an open question as to whether it's actually going to do that. I think it probably will. But I wonder, is it going to be better technology? Is it just going to be better applications that seem to be a bit more agentic? We kind of spoke to this a little bit earlier, and kind of more intuitively work with different kinds of business operations. That's the thing that I'm kind of really wondering, what is it going to take for this technology to have the impact that many people predict it's going to have, and how soon is that going to come?
Yeah, I think right now, right? So when I talk to people in companies, I think the consensus is it's not a technical or technology problem, it's a
Yeah.
value
Yes.
problem, right? So how do we make sure that we are we're actually delivering some value instead of hype, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I
That's
think
always the
one possible answer there is, you know, maybe start narrow, start
Yeah.
small, right? So
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses need to be kind of focused on how they roll it out and accept that it's still very early days, and you need to kind of start small and scale wisely. And that's something that I say to a lot of businesses that I speak to on this topic.
which actually one last topic here. So which actually ties to another section in your report, which is skills.
Yeah.
Right. So people think that, okay, so now that we have AI, since we're all going to lose our job, we don't need any more skills. So talk to us about skill development and skills in the age of AI.
Well, I'm going to use this quote from kind of Eric Brynjolfsson, one of the AI Index steering committee members, but I think he once said that, AI is not going to replace workers, but workers that know how to use AI are going to replace workers that don't know how to use AI. And I think that kind of hits the nail on the head, that I still think there's going to be a lot of work to go around, but I think that people that know how to use the technology well are going to be better positioned. So I think it's just a matter of kind of doing that learning and that education to really understand what you could do with the tech and how you can kind of level it up. I think it also is a question of, yeah, what this technology can do and kind of humbling ourselves a little bit when it comes to kind of assumptions of where it might go technologically. And what I have in mind here is that I remember when I was, in college and graduate school, I studied a lot of economics and political science. We would read a lot of literature on automation and all these economists predicting what kind of jobs would go when technology automated these jobs. And a lot of these economists predicted that the jobs that would go first would be the jobs of routine kind of manual work, things like cleaning toilets, flipping burgers. Now, fast forward 10 years, we've had this big technological revolution with AI, and AI can do a lot of knowledge work. It can write code, it can write a legal brief, but it can't reliably flip a burger for you or make a Big Mac for you in McDonald's. And I don't think that's something that a lot of people have expected. So, a lot of it, I think, is just trying to, for most people, I think accepting that AI is widely usable, trying to find ways to understand how to work with it and use it. But also, I think we need to kind of admit that we know a lot less than we actually think we do about how this technology is going to move forward. And when it takes a step forward, being there to retrain, relearn, and develop new skills. And until it does, kind of being honest with ourselves about what AI can do and what it cannot do.
I love that Eric quote. It also ties to what I pointed out earlier, which is just because you're a junior developer doesn't mean uh, there's no future for you. In
Exactly.
fact, your future might be brighter than the senior developers who are not embracing this technology.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you know how to use this tech well to kind of drive even more value, then you're going to be incredibly valuable to a lot of these different business entities.
Yeah, and with that, thank you, Nestor, and talk to you again next year or
Yeah, it was a
soon.
pleasure.